Okay, so hello everyone, and it's nice to see all of you yet again. Let me just mute some people. Our online series, which started with the COVID, continues to bring together scholars and Holocaust researchers worldwide. As we know, Holocaust research is a wide-scale field that calls for interdisciplinary research, and this led us to choose today's topic, Warsaw Ghetto, Sociology, Theology, Resistance. Let me share my screen for a minute. So, in Warsaw, the capital of Poland, the Nazis established the largest ghetto in all of Europe. A Judenrat, Jewish council, was established under the leadership of Adam Cherniakov. And in October 1940, the establishment of a ghetto was announced. On November 16th, the Jews were forced inside the area of the ghetto. Masses of refugees transported to Warsaw brought the ghetto population up to 450,000. Surrounded by walls they built with their own hands and under strict and violent guard, the Jews of Warsaw were cut off from the outside world. The living conditions were unbearable, and the ghetto was extremely crowded. However, the walls of the ghetto could not stop the cultural, spiritual, religious, and social activity of its inhabitants. In July 1942, the mass deportations to the Treblinka death camp began. When the first deportation orders were received, Adam Cherniakov, the chairman of the Judenrat, refused to prepare the lists of persons for deportation and instead committed suicide on July 23, 1942. Various types of resistance took place in the Warsaw Ghetto, ranging from documenting Nazi crimes against the Jews to armed resistance, culminating in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The Germans, under the command of Jürgen Stroop, ended the liquidation of the ghetto on May 16, 1943, as Stroop stating in his daily report to Berlin that the former Jewish quarter in Warsaw is no more. Today, we will hear from our distinguished presenters about different aspects of this ghetto in Warsaw. I would like to mention that we are recording this session and will upload it to our website. And please keep your microphones on mute and post your questions for our presenters on the chat. As always, I want to thank Dr. Boaz Cohen, the head of the Holocaust Studies program at the Western Galilee College, Dr. Yaron Pasher and Jan Bujlaf from the organizing team. And now I would like to give the floor to Dr. Yaron Pasher. Yaron, the Zoom is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniela, for this brief reminder of today's context. Our first speaker for today is a very good friend and colleague of the Holocaust Studies program at Western Galilee. I am very honored and privileged to introduce to you Professor Daniel Reiser, who is head of the Department of Jewish Thought at Herzog College. He specializes in Hasidic philosophy, modern mysticism, and theology and the Shoah. His book, Sermons from the Years of Rage, in 2017 was awarded the Yad Vashem International Book Prize for Holocaust Research in 2018. And his latest books are Imagery, Techniques in Modern Jewish Mysticism, Language of Truth in the Mother Tongue, the Yiddish Sermons of Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Leib Alter in 2020. And he is also a co-editor for Hasidim, Suffering and Renewal, the Pre-War and Holocaust Legacy for Rabbi Clonimus, Kalman Shapira, 2021. Today, Professor Reiser is going to speak about the sermons of the Piaseczno Rebbe as spiritual response and struggle in the Warsaw Ghetto. Professor Reiser, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. I just want to share a screen with you. I'll enlarge it in a minute. Okay. In World War I, the Piaseczno Rebbe, Rabbi Clonimus Kalman Shapiro, 1889 to 1943. Here's the first screen. Sorry, we'll start from here. In 1923, he established the Yeshiva Das Moishe, which was one of the largest yeshivot in Warsaw, with 300 students enrolled. He's mostly known for his sermons he delivered and wrote in Warsaw, mostly known as entitled as by the title Esh Kodesh, or as he titled them in his handwritten manuscript, Sermons from the Years of Rage. Here you see the sermons themselves. This is in with scholars around. That's the original manuscript, and here was published. These sermons were delivered from September 14th, 1939, 2 weeks after the Germans invaded Poland, to July 18th, 1942, several days before the onset of their great action, Akcja, in the Warsaw Ghetto. The sermons are written as a commentary to the parasha, the weekly Torah reading, traditional portions. There are few extant documents of rabbinic thought composed under the Nazi regime. As such, this collection of sermons, effectively the final Hasidic work to be written in Poland, is noted by Mandel Piekarz, is among the canonical, if not one of the leading works of Orthodox thought written during this period. Surprisingly, the sermons make no direct reference to current political or historical events. Rabbi Shapiro never mentioned the Germans or later on important ghetto personalities by name and does not relate directly to specific events. However, these sermons have indirect references, as Judy Baumel-Schwartz and Nehemiah Poland have shown, such as mentioning the wicked ones, or referring to suffering, to agony, to physical and mental distress, to the pain of losing loved ones, and to the crisis and to faith. It seems that the aims of these sermons were to instill hope and self-respect, to offer guidance, to set forth a religious path, and to convince listeners, and no doubt the author himself, that spiritual achievements and human dignity remained possible despite the German effort to destroy them. However, that was not their sole purpose. Not only delivered the sermons orally, but also took pains to preserve them in writing. It is evident from the sermons of the later half of 1941 and onward that Rabbi Shapiro was well aware that his chances of survival and those of the people around him were steadily diminishing, and that the destruction wrought by war, including spiritual and religious crises, will never be fully healed. And let's see what he says about it. At 1941, who is not pained as they behold the suffering of Israel in body and soul, and whose heart does not ache when they see that there are no chadarim, no yeshivot, obviously he said chadorim, no yeshivas, no place of Torah. This is not only the case in this moment, in presence, means as the synagogues are destroyed, but the conditions of the present will also be manifested in the future. For Young men who are students of Torah will be lacking. Some are missing on account of unnatural deaths and starvation, God save us, and others built by circumstances to go out and seek sustenances for themselves. From where shall we lay hold of lads who are students of Torah if now they are non-studying? Also, many have not withstood the test and driven by hunger had gone out to the market on the Shabbat in order to barter. Do we really think that such lads and young men who have spent years wandering about the marketplace and streets, conducting business or begging for bread, whether on weekend or on the Shabbat, while they have forgotten the Torah and Hasidic teachings they acquired over several years in the Chadorim and Yeshivas, do we really think that when the opportunity arises that one will return to the Chadarim and Yeshivot as before? So obviously, he understands that the future won't be the same. Given these circumstances, I'll leave it here. These circumstances, there is no doubt that the effort taken to preserve these sermons in writing, particularly in light of the difficult physical conditions prevailing at that time in the ghetto, indicate a broader objective. This collection, Sermons from the Years of Rage, is distinguished by its willingness to confront the experience of suffering. And here we have it. When we study the words of the prophets, he's saying this, you see Shabbat Chazon. So this is before Tisha B'Av, several days before Tisha B'Av, July 18, 1942, just before the great Aktzia. So he's writing, we have studied the words of the prophets and of our sages of blessed memory regarding the tribulations, yes, the suffering of the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem. We thought we had some grasp of these tribulations, even crying on occasions as that at that time. However, and this I think is very strong, now we see how great the difference is between hearing about tribulations and experiencing them. God save us, such that they are nearly incomparable. Rabbi Shapiro shares his intimate doubts and misgivings with the reader, producing a unique and moving document. An examination of these sermons does not reveal a clear and defined stance or either the meaning of suffering or the aim of the sermons themselves. Instead, Rabbi Shapiro invites the reader to join his own struggle to persist. In one of his first sermons, Rabbi Shapiro declares his aim to provide strength and encouragement. And I'm quoting, that you, he's speaking to the listeners, might be strengthened through me. This is Parashat Vayeshev. 2 years later, Rabbi Shapiro admits that he's not longer sure. Yeah, he's not persuaded by his own words of consolation. Here, let's see it here on the bottom. Particularly, as the wars continue, this was written Shabbat Zachor just before Purim, February 28, 1942. Particularly as the wars continue, even one who has strengthened himself, obviously speaking about himself, and the rest of the Jews, he is a Rebbe, he was comforting the people from the outset. This person himself, it's obvious that he's referring to himself, is now tired of strengthening and comforting himself. Even if he wishes to strain and offer whatever comforting and strengthening words he may, he cannot find the words because during the lengthy days of woes, he had already said and repeated everything he can say. The words have grown old and have no further effect on him and on his listeners. Such honesty has few in rabbinic literature. Think about it, for 2.5 years, Rabbi Shapiro preaches, encourages, and tries to comfort. Now, as his sermons draw to a close and the sorrows are increasing, he publicly declares that he no longer has the strength to fortify and console himself or the strength to fortify and console his listeners. This obviously raises the question of why he exerted such energy to complete his manuscript, correcting the sermon and committing them to the future future publication. A philological examination of the handwritten manuscript, sermons from the Years of Rage, indicates that the sermons were produced and edited in several layers, one proof succeeding another. I would like to show you the manuscript and the different layers. When you look at the manuscript itself, you see the first layer of proofreading that he crosses out words, and I colored it in yellow. The crossed out words are in those inside this blue מסגרת, forgot the blue
framework.
Frame, thank you. The blue frame, and you see that's the crossed out, and then I did this underlined in the yellow. So that's the first proofreading. And it's obviously not done while he's writing it because there's no room for the word. Sometimes he crosses out a word and writes the next one next to it. And you see why, because he wrote milamata with a tav and here he wrote milamata with a tet. So this is a proofreading while writing. But then you see this is the first layer when he reads it, when it's all done and he crosses out words and writes this first layer. Then comes the second layer, which is circled in red. And he has this letter, which is an arrow, or the letter shin, but it must be more an arrow than shin. And he writes always in the margins, in the sides. And this is on the 99 pages of manuscript. So you see, this is the second, what I call the second layer. That's always in the side of the page, his comments and additions. So he does here, he revises sermons. The third layer is he writes letters, writes Hebrew letters, what we call print letters, Dreifuss, and then adds those in the top and in the bottom. I don't know here if we can, we can see it here. On the top, you see the green letters. And this is systematic, It's not just an assumption. Further evidence of this appears in the letter by Rabbi Shapiro attached to the manuscripts with instructions for the reader and publisher, including and explaining about the system he had devised for proofing his text. We won't read it, but here he adds the different layers, and according to, I cannot elaborate now, but it's obvious that that some of them are, at least the ones that are in that I circled in green, the letters are additions in 1942, are late additions. That's what I call the third layer of proofreading. Many of the marginal notes were actually written, as I said, at late 1942, though Rabbi Shapiro was already aware that Polish Jewry was facing an exceptional catastrophe from which it might never recover. Rabbi Shapiro, who probably knew that he was going to die and had already lost all his family, how did he occupy himself? With correcting and editing his sermons. Let's go back to the manuscript. When I saw this, and I told myself, this obviously, according to the content also, was written in 1942. In some of them, think about what's happening. There's the big aktia. People are being shot in the road. And his proof is reviewing his manuscript, fixing spelling mistakes, changing from singular form to plural and the opposite, or from the feminine to masculine and the opposite. People are being shot outside and you're sitting in their house and changing from who to he. Well, what's going on here? Moreover, all of this was done without a certainty that these sermons will ever be found and published. And he's preparing a letter, as I said, for the publisher. I believe that such literary activity is a testimony to an inner struggle. On one hand, there is a tragic death, as I said, people are being shot. So there is a tragic death, and that destroys everything. While on the other hand, a new literary creation, a new life is produced. Beginning in the 1970s, a psychological theory was developed that was concerned with the influence of awareness of death on human cognition behavior, terror management theory. The Jewish American writer and culture anthropologist Ernst Becker claimed that all creative activity is directly related to the denial of death. For him, culture and creativity supply a certain defense against the fear of death, while the denial of death motivates men to write and create. In other words, human creative activity is a form of ignoring death, an attempt to avoid the unavoidable end. According to this model, writing may have offered Rabbi Shapiro a mental reprieve from a bitter reality and death surrounding him, despite the fact that his sermons direct suffering. The second model, we'll see now, a different approach, suggests that human creativity struggles with death and rather than evading it, emerges victorious. There are matters more important than life, and engagement with them presents the victory of the spirit over death and the physical. When Socrates was sentenced to death by the court of Athens at 399 BCE, he was faced with the possibility of evading and changing his punishment. However, Socrates decided for philosophical reasons to bear his punishment and drink the cup of poison. His death was portrayed by Plato as a victory of the philosopher and of philosophy. His engagement with philosophy overcame his instinctive fear of dying. This is a victory, a spiritual one, not an escape. Viktor Frankl, the founder of logotherapy, wrote about his experiences in German concentration camps and maintained that he and his fellow prisoners succeeded in actualizing their spiritual freedom in the very space where they had been deprived from all human rights. Frankl came to our manuscript ready for publication, which was confiscated upon arrival. Realizing that the manuscript was lost, he began to reconstruct the work, an activity that gave meaning to his life and endowed him with physical and spiritual strength. Now we'll quote from him. He says, "Certainly," he testifies, "my deep desire to write this manuscript I knew helped me to survive the rigors of the camps I was in. For instance, when in a camp in Bavaria, I fell ill with typhus fever, I jotted down on little scraps of paper many notes," he writes then, "intended to enable me to rewrite the manuscript should I live to the day of liberation. I am sure," he says, "that this reconstruction of my lost manuscript in the dark barracks of the Bavarian concentration camp assisted me in overcoming the danger of cardiovascular collapse." The writing of notes on scraps of paper and the desire to rewrite his book enabled Frankl to overcome his difficult surroundings and actualize his spiritual freedom. According to this model, and this is the second model we're presenting, Rabbi Shapiro's writings are an actualization of freedom in a freedomless world. A third approach, and this is the third in the writings of the modern writer and philosopher Lev Shestov, born as Yuda Leib Schwarzman, 1866 to 1938. Shestov argued that the meaningless and despair are primarily human experiences, which, however, point to the experience of faith beyond both knowledge and hopelessness. Now, such a philosophy approach was developed by Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, and numerous works of Russian literature. But Shestov, I would say, brought it to a climax. According to Shestov, the experience of doubt and the deepest uncertainty are continuous with the experience of faith. The believer begins his path in the depth of despair, but it is from this very depth that he cries to God. And what does he cry out? "Out of the depths I call you, O..." And what does he call God? My God, my God, Why have you abandoned me? Tehillim 22:2, which means, Eli, Eli, lama azavtani. According to Shestov, faith is not a scene of contentment, but rather a struggle and bitterness and a darkness spirit. And I quote again from Psalm Tehillim, I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why must I walk in gloom? Eli, ken, omar le'el sali, lama shchachtani, lama koder elech velachatz oyev. According to Shestov, the individual finds himself in a constant struggle against reality. This struggle is a state of faith. Much like awareness of despair, which is the starting point of religious experience, awareness of death, also serves a central function in Shestov's thought. Only death, according to Shestov, I see I'm here too early. I was supposed to, okay, we'll leave it, the screen here. Only death can shake, according to Shestov, can shake off from men the false enchantments of this world. Shestov's philosophy seeks to instruct men to recognize the horrific reality of mortality and the lack of importance of an existence bound to end. All of these are meant to instruct him, however, in that spiritual strength, which is faith, to lead him to God, who will provide him not only with a primary meaning to his life, but also with spiritual freedom. Death exposes men to the end and consequent meaningless nature of his life, which reminds him of his finality, in order that he not be overwhelmed by a fabricated world devoid of meaning. The fear of death shatters the illusion of our existence as independent and distinct beings. The possibility of faith, thus, according to Shestov, develops in the very face of death. The Hasidic thinker, and here we come to this slide, the Hasidic thinker Hillel Zeitlin, who was acquainted with Rabbi Shapiro and even wrote a glowing review on his educational book, A Student Obligation, Chovat HaTalmidim, 1932, was also influenced by Shestov. In an essay titled Shestov, From the Depth of Doubt and Despair, Zeitlin addresses the extreme negation of all values and meanings in the world, which found expression in Shestov's thought. Zeitlin notes that Shestov's negations must be understood as continuations of, and here I'm reading from the screen, David Hume's efforts in the critique of human perception, Schopenhauer's efforts in the negation of any value of life, Nietzsche's efforts in the critique of men and all that he has, Rousseau and Tolstoy's efforts in the negation of all his called culture and civilization, Dostoevsky's efforts in his groping and his prodding. And that is from that very depths of nothingness that he calls out to God wonder, through recognizing the nullity of all that is human. He, Shestov, seeks the one who spoke the world and the world came into being. This is an expression taken from the sages in the Mishnah and the Talmud, Misha Amar Vaya Olam. That's the way the sages refer many times to God. According to this third model, Rabbi Shapiro writings are not a manifestation of a polarized life led between two extremes, a mode of innovative creation and reality which resembles death and destruction. The bitter existence to which he was fated had already lost all meaning, and the works he wrote were a possession to bring before God, evoking the Talmudic saying, praiseworthy is he who comes here with the teachings in his hands. Imam tachato beyado, mi shemagia lepo imam tachato beyado, Baba Batra 10b. Rabbi Shapiro, according to this, did not record his sermons for others, but rather for himself. As he wrote in a pre-war sermon in Derech HaMelech, I'm quoting, this is not on the slide, behold, the person does not write solely for others, but mostly for himself. This is Derech HaMelech, Parashat Vayeshev 1929. In another quotation, a stronger one, but it works better in Hebrew, I'll have to explain it. He says, every personal impression needs paper and space to be written on. Now in Hebrew, impression is roshem, and roshem as a verb is to write. So he plays with this root, rei, shin, mem, and says, kol roshem tzarich lirshom. So this is writing for yourself and not for others. Conclusion. The manuscript sermons from the years of rage is a testimony of the phenomenon of human spiritual response and struggle via writing. 3 philosophical and psychological explanations have been given in this lecture of this phenomenon. The first one was, as you see, ignoring the world, the attempt to avoid the unavoidable death. The second one is struggling with the world, the actualization of freedom in a freedomless world. Now I'm going to struggle with this world, a disillusionment with the world through recognizing the nullity of all that is human. He seeks he who spoke and the world came into being. I'm not saying that these are the only models. I brought 3 models. Obviously, you can say that is also a fourth and many other. I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a philosopher, but obviously there can be more models of just limud Torah. This is the way he learns Torah. But what I wanted is to expand. And so it's not just learning Torah. Without going even into the content, just by looking at the manuscript and the energy he puts in and changing and revising it again and again and again, although he knows there's no chance. And what's the chances that this will be found and then published? But I mean, the effort that he puts in, and I'm saying, I think already is a universal. It expands the way we look at it. It gives us a universal vision. It makes this manuscript relevant for all people. And not if I'll read the content with Parshat Shavua, so it deals more with Judaism. But if I look at the structure, and that's why I brought these three models that expand our vision on this struggle, which is a universal struggle of fighting through creativity. And I think that I will use Sam Cassell's words that he uses for the whole Ring and Balloon project, that you don't have to fight with, not the only way to fight is with a gun, but it can be also with a pencil and pen. And in Hebrew, if I would translate it, then it even works better. המלחמה היא לא רק בעופרת, היא גם בעיפרון. So with the same root, with that, I will end this lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Reiser, for, wow, I'd say a very impressive...
I hope I was on time. I was told 25 minutes. Okay, well,
it was fine. And again, we see meticulous research, I'd say almost a work of art. You can use all these events together. Again, I think we see how it raises the dilemmas of each community coping and adapting to the horrific events of the Holocaust. And thank you for that, Dani. We will have time for Q&As during the discussion later. And I would like to move on to our next speaker now. It's again an honor, privilege to introduce you Professor Rachel Einwohner, who has been a professor at Purdue University since 1998. Professor Einwohner's research focuses on the dynamics of protests and resistance, and her interest includes questions related to the process emergence and effectiveness, the role of gender and the identities and protest dynamics, protesters' sense of efficacy, and the creation of solidarity and diverse movement. She is also part of an interdisciplinary research team using Twitter data to examine diversity and inclusion in contemporary social movements. Her published work has appeared in top leading journals, and she co-edited 2 volumes in the Oxford Handbook of U.S. Women's Social Movement Activities in identity work and social movements. Her recent work, which has received funding from the NSF and the NEH, examines the efforts to create resistance movements in the Jewish ghettos of Nazi-occupied Warsaw, Vilna, and Lodz. And today, Professor Einwohner will speak about sociological lessons learned from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So please, Professor Einwohner, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and it's such a great pleasure and an honor to be with you all today. Hello from West Lafayette, Indiana, and thank you again for that lovely introduction and for allowing me to join you to talk about the Warsaw Ghetto, which is such a crucially important place, space, event, memory. It means so many things, and I'm really honored to be able to help pick apart some really interesting aspects of what happened in the ghetto now over 80 years ago. I need to share my screen. My students know I'm not so good at Zoom, so here we go. Share, and I will start my little PowerPoint from beginning. Okay, here we go. It's so wonderful to listen to Professor Reiser's presentation because I think what I have to say is, on the one hand, very, very different, but also I think very complementary to some of the large themes that he brought up. So thank you for that wonderful talk. And what I'd like to talk about today are some sociological lessons that we can learn from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So I am a sociologist. I come to the study of Jewish resistance as a sociologist who's broadly interested in protest and resistance. And the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, of course, is the biggest and best known case of Jewish resistance, I should say, armed, sustained Jewish resistance during the Holocaust. Of course, Jewish people resisted in many different ways, both individually and collectively. But in terms of a sustained armed uprising, it's the biggest and the best known case. Many scholars have written a lot about it. And of course, the ghetto and the ghetto fighters have been commemorated and memorialized in many different ways. I'm sure many of you recognize these two pictures that I'm sharing with you on the screen right now, just two of many memorials, commemorative sites. And I should say that both of these pictures were taken by my husband, Chuck Goldberg, who's on this Zoom call somewhere, when we went to Warsaw in 2019 before the pandemic. Of course, on the left is the famous Rappaport's monument in the site of the former ghetto, right across from the Polin Jewish Museum. And then on the right is one of many memorials kind of right around there throughout the immediate area of the old ghetto. And this one is actually at Mila 18, where the resistance fighters, Mordechai and Ilevich and others perished during the fighting. And these sites of memory are so important to remind us all what happened in the ghetto and to remind us of the resistance that took place there. And you know, in Israel, the Warsaw Ghetto and other examples of Jewish resistance are very well understood, very well commemorated. In Warsaw, they're commemorated every year on the anniversary of the uprising. People put out yellow daffodils at the sites, because that's what Marek Edelman used to do when he was still alive, always place daffodils at the sites to remember his fallen comrades. But in the US, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and other examples of Jewish resistance are not as well known. In fact, in the US, we still kind of fall into this prevalent myth of this persistent myth of Jewish passivity. The idea that Jewish people did not fight back, that the Jewish people were, you know, meek and went to the slaughter like sheep. You know, we hear that phrase a lot. And so it's so important to memorialize the uprising, to prove to people who need to hear this that, you know, Jewish people did fight back in many different ways. But as a sociologist, I would like to move beyond using the case of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising to dispel that myth of Jewish passivity, because it is a myth. But I am very interested in this case and in other cases of sustained armed Jewish resistance during the Holocaust, because these cases are very puzzling to me as a sociologist. So I'd like to say just a little bit about why it is that I, as a sociologist, am so interested in these cases, and especially in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. These are puzzling. This case, this event, this example of resistance is puzzling because it's what people in my field would call a deviant case, meaning one that doesn't seem to conform to what our theories teach us about why mass protest movements happen or why mass examples of collective resistance happen. Sociologists and political scientists have developed a large body of theory that seek to understand social movements, revolutions, collective mass resistance. And, you know, a lot of these theories are based on protests in Western democracies, okay? And so they teach us certain things. These theories argue that in order for a mass resistance movement, for mass protest to take place, we need to have a couple of things happening. These theories argue, and I'm kind of taking a broad swipe here, but these theories argue that these collective actors, these would-be protesters, first of all, need to have resources, the material stuff they need to fight back with, and whatever that means in their circumstance, whether it's guns, whether it's people to march, people to sit in the plaza, people to chain themselves to the nuclear reactor, you know, whatever it is, they need resources, they need stuff. They need what our theories call opportunity or political opportunity, which is thought to be some kind of an opening in the political system that affords these would-be protesters, these potential resistors, some amount of breathing room. Either the authorities are looking the other way, or these folks have some new amount of political power that gives them that much breathing room just to be able to get together and do their thing. And then finally, our theories argue that you need hope. You need some kind of sense that you will succeed, some kind of sense that you can pull your protest or your resistance movement off. And so as a sociologist, when I look at these theories and then I look at the Warsaw Ghetto, I say, how could this have happened? If our theories are correct, then the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising never should have happened, because Jewish people in the Warsaw Ghetto did not have sufficient resources to fight back with. They didn't have sufficient food, water, housing. They certainly didn't have enough guns and weapons to fight back against Nazi forces. They had no political window of opportunity. They were a besieged, stateless people with no rights, not even the rights to their own lives. And they had no hope. They had no hope for survival. And in fact, that's part of the reason why they fought back, but I'll point that out in a second. So there seems to be an absolute absence of the factors that our theories teach us need to be in place for resistance to occur. So that's what makes this case so puzzling and so fascinating to me. I want to ask, why did the uprising take place, given when our theories would say it never really should have taken place at all? Why did Jewish people fight back in the Warsaw Ghetto? So I'm going to share a picture that is well known, taken, I believe, from the Stroop report that Daniela mentioned at the beginning of her excellent opening remarks to this session. And I often show this very image to my students or to other audiences that are less knowledgeable about the Holocaust. And so this is an image taken from the fighting. So at least three in the foreground, some other fighters in the background, fighters who have been captured by Nazi soldiers. And the contrast between the Jewish fighters and the enemy, the people who have captured them, is just so stark. The Jewish fighters are not wearing uniforms. They do not seem to have weapons, as opposed to the much better resourced, much better trained soldiers who have captured them, found them. And so this image often helps me illustrate that puzzle and why it is so interesting to me to try to figure out why the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising happened at all. So I should say that in my work, I'm actually interested in comparing three different ghettos, three very well-known, very well-documented ghettos. The ghettos in Warsaw, Vilna, and Lodz. And because as a sociologist, I'm trained to try to account for variation across cases. So I have a very small sample size, a small n, as we say. But across these three ghettos, there's really interesting variation with respect to resistance. So in the Warsaw Ghetto, there was this large, sustained, armed ghetto uprising. In Vilna, there was an attempt to create the exact same type of uprising in the ghetto, but the ghetto fighters could not make it happen, and they ended up fleeing from the Vilna ghetto and went to the forests to fight as partisans, carrying out different kinds of resistance in the forests surrounding Vilna. And then in Lodz, there was no armed ghetto uprising at all. And so in my broader work, I'm interested in comparing these cases and engaging in what we call comparative historical sociology to try to account for these differences. And that's the topic of my book, which has now come out. But for my remarks today, in the theme of our session, I want to limit my remarks and my focus on the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and kind of some ideas about why it happened and what we can learn sociologically from this case. So Daniela gave us a very nice kind of timeline of some of the important events in the Warsaw Ghetto, but I would like to flesh that out a little bit by pointing out to a few more important turns in the life of the ghetto, if you will. I'm a sociologist, but I try to take history very seriously, and history in terms of kind of understanding narrative over time. And to understand the Warsaw Ghetto, it's important to look for different turning points that signaled transformative events, changes in the way things were taking place in the ghetto, and also in these important events that signaled changes in people's understanding of what was happening to them. And the mass deportations in the summer of 1942, which happened at the time that the Rebbe was reworking these sermons that Professor Reiser told us so beautifully about, that is a really important turning point in the story of the ghetto. But let me back up. As Daniela said, the Warsaw Ghetto was established in October 1940, so about a year after the German invasion of Poland, of the part of Poland that Warsaw was located in. And as a large ghetto, as Daniela said, as many as 450,000 people were confined in the ghetto. And therefore, it represented all aspects of Jewish life in the ghetto: religious Jews and secular Jews and laborers and artisans, and not surprisingly, a very large contingent of youth activists representing all different types of movements on the left, on the right, Zionists, socialists, Bundists, all kinds of ists, as I tell my students. And so the youth activists who were in the ghetto, in the beginning of the time of the ghetto, these youth activists were very focused on keeping their movements going. The various movements. The youth would come together as best they could and continue their reading and their lecturing, and those who were Zionists continued coming together in their kibbutzim and still planning on making an immigration, making aliyah and immigrating to Palestine as soon as they could. And their focus was very much still on the kind of normal business of their activism as it had been before the war. But importantly, the youth activists in the ghetto had strong ties. Youth activists in Warsaw had strong ties to their comrades in other ghettos, notably in Vilna, where other youth activists were experiencing not exactly the same thing as what was happening in Warsaw, because Vilna was on the Russian side, and Germans invaded Lithuania later than they invaded Poland. So some important variations in terms of timing of events and when things took place. But what's important is that the youth in Warsaw, the youth activists, I should say, in Warsaw, eventually learned about mass killings of Jews in the East, notably in Pinar, outside of Vilna. And so the youth in Warsaw, through their contacts with the youth in Vilna, began to hear about the mass killings of Jews. The youth in Warsaw also experienced this firsthand at the beginning of the Great Deportation in the summer of 1942, when suddenly every day thousands, 6,000 of people, 5,000, 6,000, thousands of people were being rounded up, taken away to Treblinka, or shot in the streets, or some combination of both. And these important pieces of information, these important turning points, signaled to the youth a realization that was crucial to what eventually became armed resistance. The young people eventually came to realize that the ghetto was not simply a miserable place to live, a miserable place of occupation, wartime occupation, in which Jewish people were starving and being worked to death. No, it was an example of genocide, and that there would be no way to survive the ghetto, and that deportation meant death, and that all roads led to Treblinka. And I'm quoting from some very famous writings written by youth activists. With that important realization, that important turn of events, the young people formed their resistance organizations, two well-known resistance organizations, one on the left and one on the right, the ZOB, the Jewish Fighting Organization, and the ZZW, the Jewish Military Union. And what's really important to note is that the young people planned for armed resistance, not as a way to save their own lives, not as a way to gain safe passage out of the ghetto, although some actually did end up surviving pretty miraculously. But they fought to fight. They fought knowing that they would die, expecting that they would die. And so the meaning of the resistance was not like what our theories in sociology say is some mass movement intended to achieve some success, achieve some freedom, achieve some policy change. No, this was a very different kind of movement, kind of resistance. Resistance was meant to choose the way these young people would die. It was understood as a way to die with dignity, not just for themselves, but for the dignity of all the Jewish people, not just in Warsaw, but throughout Europe and beyond. And in my work, I use a lot of testimonies from Holocaust survivors, and one of my main sources is the Shoah Foundation Institute at the University of Southern California. And here is just one of many, many quotes from Holocaust survivors. This is from a man named Henry Lisker, who gave his testimony in 1997, a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto who participated in the uprising, and in his own words, talking about the uprising and why the young people were fighting back. He said, there was nothing to lose. I remember the people who organized the uprising, or what was left from the overwhelming 80% of the people who had already shipped out. After this, we fought to defend our honor in the memory of our lost family, and for the sake of all the Jewish people of the world, for the honor of all the Jewish people in the world. So again, this is very different to me as a sociologist. This is a very different way of thinking about mass resistance, mass movements, mass collective action. And it requires a different way of understanding what gives rise to protest movements. So this is where I'd like to offer some of my own way of understanding what happened in the Warsaw Ghetto, and also how things happened differently in Vilna and in Lodz, And I should say that we sociologists, we like to theorize. We like to take data and theorize about our cases and offer broader explanations for what we think is going on, and then try to test that empirically again with new information and new case data. And so what I do is I start with the Warsaw Ghetto and try to come up with an explanation of what happened there, and then try to tease that out more by comparing it to Vilna and then comparing it to Lodz. But here's what I take from my read of information from all these different ghettos. To understand something like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, to understand Jewish resistance during the Holocaust, and again, the kind of resistance that I'm talking about, of course, is this collective, sustained, armed resistance. Many different ways of resisting, but that's the one I'm kind of focused on because that's what theories are focused on. I argue that if we want to understand why this movement, this resistance happened, we have to look at those turning points, and we have to look at the critical conclusions that the actors, the resistors, came to. In the Warsaw Ghetto, that critical conclusion, which came both from information from Vilna and Pinar, and also based on, eyewitness to what was happening in the Warsaw Ghetto, this change from we can survive this and let's keep our movement going to we cannot survive this and none of us can survive this. We cannot survive was a critical conclusion that led to decisions about resistance. They believed that if they could not survive, then they would choose an action that was determined, that was intended to determine the way that they would die as strong, proud, and dignified people, rather than as the victims of murder. But it's not simply enough, I argue, to think about that turn in consciousness, if you will, or that critical conclusion from we can survive this to no, we absolutely cannot survive this, because there are different ways to react to impending death. And Professor Reiser, I'm so grateful for your talk, because you introduced just a very different way of thinking about how people respond to their potential death or maybe their imminent death. And in the Warsaw Ghetto, the response to the we cannot survive this, the response that resonated with the youth activist was, we're going to resist. Not we're going to wait and let them kill us, but we are going to organize and we are going to get what resources we can, even though they fought back with very few resources, very few guns, very few other, the material stuff you need to fight back. They decided that they would resist with weapons. But that, of course, was not the only way people could and did resist in the Warsaw Ghetto. But that was the response chosen by people who were already activists, who already had a collective orientation, an orientation towards collective action. And for some of the activists, especially the ZZW, they had a more of a kind of a militaristic orientation towards action anyway. So this response resonated with them and in a way made a lot of sense. I'd also like to conclude and just wrap up with some broader sociological lessons that I take away that I'd like to share with you if there are any budding sociologists out there. So as I write about this case, I am engaged in conversation with other sociologists like me. So I use the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising as a case of collective resistance that to me tells other sociologists we need to continue to question our theories. We need to continue to study these deviant, these outlier cases, if you will, that don't seem to conform to what we think we know, and use these cases to broaden our understanding and to theorize in new and different ways about human social action, whether it's resistance or anything else that we want to study. But to other audiences who more interdisciplinary audiences, I'd also like to leave you with this, because to me, and this is my bias perhaps as a sociologist, but to me there are just some very core sociological factors that happened in the Warsaw Ghetto that help explain why this uprising took place, and really help explain when it happened, when it did. It didn't happen when the ghetto was first created in October 1940. The conditions that people reacted to unfolded over time. And there's some more sociological stuff, if you will, my favorite word, going on there. Thinking about the narrative, how things unfolded over time, again, clues us into the importance of what people knew, how they understood, how they interpreted their circumstances. The youth activists interpreted their circumstances in a particular way that led them to resistance. And other constituencies, other segments of the community understood what was happening to them in different ways. And sadly, over time, as the community was diminished and more people had been deported or succumbed, the activists were the ones who were left. I also think there's an important story here about groups and collective identity, and that's something that we sociologists pay a lot of attention to and take very seriously. Coming together in a mass protest organization or in a mass movement requires solidarity, requires people coming together, putting their differences aside. The ZOB, one of the two main resistance organizations in the Warsaw Ghetto, had to form a solidaristic unit despite some differences across, some ideological differences across the component groups of that resistance organization. Groups with different ideologies, Zionist versus Bundist, for example, who differed on lots of different things, but they were able to come together even though the ZZW fought separately. So there's an important message about solidarity and bridging solidarity across differences and coming together in response to a shared threat and a shared danger. But there's also the importance of youth groups having strong ties to each other. And this leads me to my next point. For the young people to realize, to have that switch from we can survive the ghetto to no, we cannot survive the ghetto, and therefore we must resist even though it's not going to save our lives, that required kind of a leap of faith. When word was coming from Vilna to the Warsaw Ghetto, where the Vilna activists were saying, we are under threat, we are being killed, all Jews will eventually be killed, we're actually going to resist and we think you should too. Listening to that message and taking that message in required a strong connection between the different groups of youth activists in the different ghettos, and also required the youth to have a leap of faith in terms of what they thought was really going on. Because during the time of the ghettos, there was so much confusion. It was so hard to get real good information between Nazi propaganda and other really, misinformation campaigns. Very hard to know exactly what was going on, but the youth believed in each other and were able to take that information in and use it to form their resistance organizations, and ultimately led to the uprising. So I think I'm beyond my time, so I'm going to thank you, and I acknowledge some of the people who have funded my research. And again, thank you so much. I'm very pleased and honored to be participating in this session today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for this thought-provoking talk. And I actually have your book right here. So thank you so much for giving us a lot to think about. And now I would like to welcome Professor Havi Dreifuss. We are honored to have you here with us, not for the first time. Professor Dreifuss will respond before opening the floor for a discussion with our audience. She is specialized in the history of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, and especially in Poland and in the Warsaw Ghetto. She's a professor in the Department of Jewish History at the University of Tel Aviv, Israel, and head of the Center for Research on the Holocaust in Poland in the International Institute for Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem. Professor Dreifuss is also a member of the Advisory Committee of the Holocaust Restitution Company of Israel and the Advisory Committee of Research and Documentation for the Claims Conference. Her recent research deals with examining the religious life of Jews during the Holocaust. Professor Havi Dreifuss, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniela. First of all, for this wonderful program and for having me. And thank you, both speakers, for very, very interesting and thought-provoking lectures, which actually deal with different aspects of Jewish reaction and specifically with different aspects of the essence of resistance. Now, as Boaz has written many years ago, emphasizing the resistant aspect immediately after the war was very, very important in Europe as well as in young Israel. It was important in Europe because each and every nation wanted to show their part in defeating the Nazis. And we all know how in France, suddenly everybody became part of the resistance. And in young Israel, it was part of the fighting over the identity. Maybe I will learn something from the last speaker, and thus the resistance was very much emphasized. But when those physical resistance actions of Jews during the Holocaust were so much emphasized, there was also some kind of criticism, and I want to share with you two citations from one of the first, actually the first conference at Yad Vashem from year 1968, in which the following debate had occurred, and it was between Mark Dvorzetsky, who referred to the term of Amidah and was trying to talk about different sorts of resistance, which were not necessarily physical ones. And he said the following, that the perception of Amidah, this non-physical resistance, describe a form of Jewish non-conformism designed to oppose the crimes of the Nazi, who conspired to destroy the Jews, deprive them of their humanity, and reduce them into nothing more than a shadow on the brink of death. Now, he was criticized by Yeshayahu too, who asked whether the word Amidah was exclusively positive term, or whether it could also refer to stance of behavior or structure that we would consider immoral. And then he had many questions about it, and he tried to emphasize that we must not get caught up in apologetic and ignore the dark aspect of Jewish conduct, which would now be considered negative. He referred to mothers who abandoned their children and children who left their parents, and he concluded and said, we must not close our eyes to those facts if we wish to provide a complete picture. Now, I'm giving those citations because we have to remember how this discussion about resistance started, and remember that throughout the years, many changes have occurred. I will just mention two of them. First of all, we are less judgment against those Holocaust survivors, and less referring to those who didn't fight with arms as people who went like lambs to slaughter. And another thing that happened, and actually we could hear the echoes of it even in those two excellent lectures, is that numerous responses are considered today as resistance. And Daniela mentioned those in the beginning: prayer, education, documentation, smuggling, and more. And I think that this is what makes this meeting so interesting when we're trying to look at the Warsaw Ghetto from sociology, theology, and return to the term of resistance. And I think that those two lectures really provide us a fresh look on resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, listening to those two lectures and actually reading about different Jewish reaction during the Holocaust, I many times asked myself, to what aspect of Nazi policy or to the reality that was created by the Nazi policy did the Jews oppose? And how was this opposition or resistance expressed? Now, of course, this changed according to the time, and we could hear from Professor Reiser when he referred to the sermons of Piaseczno rabbi, how this was a spiritual resistance that did not have any specific mention to the Germans, and only to the reality that was created by them. And Daniel, if I may, also refer to different aspects of this internal struggle, ignoring, struggling, recognizing the human limits, and so on. And I think that what we can see when we hear those examples is how maintaining a religious lifestyle, despite all, or adopting it to the reality, and thus leaving out important parts of this religious life, were both seen as resistance. And just to give a short example to that, I want to add some visual documentation. We all know that religious Jews were abused, and beards are only one example. And we know that some of the Jews, and we're talking here a very small minority, kept their beards until, this is a picture taken from Stroop album, until April 1943. But we know that the vast majority of the Jews hid their beards. And actually, I have some pictures of Jews with beard before the war and how they looked during the war, but they have some humiliating aspect, and this is why I'm not sharing them. But we can see that preserving religious life or adopting them to the reality, both of them are grafted as some kind of resistance. And this, I think, is what is so important in Daniel's paper, in which he had shown us that despite the fact that Nazi Germany as a term did not take an important part in this way of resistance, meaning that it wasn't mentioned in the sermon, it was seen more as an internal battle of the man, woman, or of the community, and how those people actually struggled to keep their life as they were before. It could be their Jewish life as private people, it could be their Jewish life as communities. And here, actually, what they had to do is to overcome the human temptation in so many fields and maintain in different manners a Jewish life. It could be by observing the beard or whatever, and it could be by concealing it. So we can see a language that is in many aspects very similar to languages that we could find in sermons of rabbis before. What do I do with this internal struggle? And how does this specific reality change us? Now, if I will return to visual documentation and refer to Rachel's lecture, so this picture, of course, is very important. This is, of course, part of Syria, and actually a picture that was taken a little bit before, and you can see that here the ruins are not so spread out as we can see in the second picture, and we can see that the smoke here is lighter than the second one. And what is maybe the most important things, not most important, but one important thing in those pictures, as well as in this well-known one, is that those people are not necessarily, are actually not of the Jejevu and not of the Zhou. That means we're seeing here that people, and we're talking about over 50,000 Jews who lived in the Warsaw Ghetto during the uprising, that were not part of the Jejevu, or not part of the Zhou during the uprising, and actually the vast majority of the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto during the uprising were civilians. Now, they had their own way of resistance, and I'll give just one citation, and this is a document by Herzog from sent outside of occupied Poland on May 1944, and in it is said regarding to soldiers with no weapons, among thousands of men and women, old and young, the desire of resistance was born. But what kind of resistance? The masses realized that by failing to surrender, they were fighting the enemy in a special way, making it difficult for them to destroy and annihilate. Meaning that for him and for many others, there was a different aspect of resistance within the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, when I'm trying to understand better those very interesting lectures that we just heard, and we heard here different aspects of resistance. One is maybe a more internal fight, In the other one, presented by Rachel, the Nazis, of course, are very, very apparent, and it's a resistance against them. And if we'll add those tens of thousands of Jews who lived in the ghetto, it will only emphasize this aspect. And if I'll go back to the question I asked before, and that is, to what aspect of Nazi policy or of the reality created by Nazi policy did the Jews resist to, I think we can see a new set of questions. And that is this act continuous to the life before the Holocaust? And here maybe it's a question to Daniel, or to what extent was it an outcome of the crisis? So of course the challenges within Warsaw Ghetto are uncomparable to those before, but the language of personal struggle is something that we can find in many sermons of rabbis. Or a different question, was the reaction an intentional one, or was it more spontaneous? And here we can ask about the fighters or about other Jews, or how unique and unusual was this reaction. And Rachel rightly said that Warsaw Ghetto is really a very special example. How many Jews in other geographical area or similar places reacted in the same way? Was it carried out, was this action carried out by individuals, a small group or a larger group? And here's a question of identity, so important. To answer those questions, the answer to those questions can identify reactions that were more common in certain communities, certain age groups, or gender during the Holocaust years, thus contributing to a better understanding of individual and group conduct under extreme circumstances, and how the different types of actions and initiative emerged. So those were just some thoughts I had listening to those very interesting lectures. And of course, there are more questions and thoughts than answers, as we always have in those kinds of meetings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, speakers, and to Havi. We had, I think, so much thought-provoking materials and a lot of questions. What I will do, we will have one round of questions, which I will open with mine. I have this prerogative, and then we'll do another round. We have questions mostly for Rachel for the second round, but the first round we'll have you can relate to the questions that Havi raised in her response. And I will also ask, there's a general question about, do we see in both deliberations, we didn't hear anything about the polls, both in the sermons and both in the deliberations of the young people in the ghetto. So were the polls a point of reference or a point of contention, etc.? So this is one question that we had. I would like to ask about Daniel, about the sermons. I think you gave a lot of philosophical and I think mainly philosophical answers, some of which were talked about in the ghetto by Zeitlin, about why did the Rebbe sit and did all this work of editing and preparing for. And I was thinking about two things. First, I would like to hear, what do you think is the reason that it didn't mention any concrete figures or roles? Secondly, about what was the role of the sermons? Do we know anything about the impact of the sermons when they were given? Do we find anything about the impact in his writing? Or do we have anything about this, or about other sermon givers in the ghetto? And also, I was thinking about when we talked about why people do things, I think we have to go back to what, do we not have to go back to what Havi said about continuity? And this is what rabbis do. They write sermons and they want the sermons to survive, because this is the way And we have stories from Jewish history all over about people doing anything possible to save their manuscripts, or the tragedy of losing a manuscript. We know this is the relationship between the Torah scholar and his manuscript is very important. So I would like, maybe this is one of the reasons, because this is just what people do. Of course, there's some escapism in this, because you can stand in the queue for bread, but I think this is, we should ask ourselves not this. About the resistance, thank you, Rachel, for this sociological discussions. I'm an historian, and I was thinking, how much do we put into this account the general research on resistance movements? I mean, you were doing comparisons to resistance movement, more as far as I saw, modern resistance movements. And all these theories were based on modern, but we have a lot of historical analysis of what happens with resistance movements in occupied Europe. And I think the question, for example, if to resist or not, is mainly a strategical question. The Poles do not resist until 44, and the resistance in France does not resist, apart from the communists, does not resist until the landings in 44 again, because a resistance movement does not have any chance against, certainly an urban one. There's no chance against an occupying army. And they only resist when the allies are near. And this is the orders of the SOE to order resistance movements in Europe not to resist. I'm not talking partisans, I'm talking on the Western and maybe Central Europe, not to resist. So in this sense, we have to look at the Jewish case, maybe also looking at theories of resistance during the war, how resistance saw the place. I will add one more questions from the chat, and then we'll give you a round of replies. Just a minute. I'm getting this lost. Apologies. Medine asks, you talked a lot about deciding to do to resist, but what about the reasons not to open a resistance, a fight, not to start fighting? I'll ask. I will ask one more thing. We have this. I will read this from Warsaw Ghetto because I don't understand this enough. In the literature on political violence, there is a theorem that indiscriminate violence by occupation forces drives people in occupied countries to resistance and away from cooperation. So is the realization that the Germans were going to kill everyone in the case of anticipated ultimate indiscriminate violence? Well, I think, and what do you make of Finkel's argument that the resistance toolkit was decisive for the Jews to resist, and the Jewish organization acquired this toolkit during the interwar years through repressions by their respective governments? And how can we see the way they move from resistance to armed uprising? So we'll stop here. We'll give Professor Reiser a chance to answer first, and then Rachel, and we'll see what happens then.
Okay, thank you. As to Boaz, your question about concrete figures, as you put it, it's an assumption, obviously. I do not know, he does not mention, but I can say that this is common in Hasidic writings of sermons. Usually a tzaddik of a dynasty gives his lecture before the Hasidim and mentions names. For example, he does it in a wedding. So he mentions the bride and the groom and then the family. But then when he writes it as a sermon, he drops all the names because the purpose of the book is not specific for that family. And I will add now for that generation. I believe that he wanted this book to be timeless, internal, if I can use that, not relevant only for the time of the occupiers, of the Germans, of the Nazis. I thought that he believed that there's a big contribution with this book, because it's unique. He's writing about suffering while experiencing suffering. Many philosophers write about suffering. I believe that that the philosophy about suffering started from the day there was man walking in this world, because together with humanity comes the suffering. And therefore, I think that he felt that there's something unique. He's not sitting with a cigar and beer and like a nice philosopher and writing about suffering, but he's writing it within suffering. And therefore, he believes this is relevant for the future generations. And therefore, he does not refer to specific events or figures in order that this book will be relevant for the future generations. But as I said, this is an assumption. As to Havi's question, is this an outcome of just a regular crisis, or is it unique for the Shoah, for the Holocaust? It's connected to what I said before. There comes a stage in 1942 where he understands, and that's his relation to the suffering around him, that this is unique, unusual, never has been like that in the history of the Jews. And he writes it. He writes it as a comment. Whatever I wrote is because I thought they were suffering through last 2,000 years or 3,500 years if we count Egypt. But there is this stage that he said you cannot compare. And then he adds even, it's not just you cannot compare anything that happened to the Jews in history. He says, therefore, you cannot apply anything which was said in religion, by the sages, by the Talmud, by the later on the poskim, by the Jewish philosophers. You say you cannot apply it anymore to the suffering of the Holocaust. So I think that because he looks at it as a unique, that's a motivation for him to write, because this is a unique time that would never have like this in the history. And therefore, it's not just an outcome of just a crisis, but a crisis which is unusual, which is unique. So I believe that I related to both questions at the same time.
Yes, Rachel, please.
Yes, thank you, Boaz and everybody for these wonderful questions. I'm gonna and Havi, of course, wonderful commentary. I'm gonna try to briefly touch on everything you asked, and I might not do a good job. Your first question was, were the actors making reference to the Polish community? And the answer is yes, absolutely. There were certainly in Warsaw and in Vilna, there were, I guess, what we would call today, in the language of contemporary movements, allies. Members of the Polish Scout movement that were allied, that were comrades of a Shomer Tzair. My grandmother, who was of blessed memory, who was in Shomer Tzair, used to tell me about Irenka, who turned out to be this kind of famous Polish scout, who did provide assistance. But also, of course, there were tensions, and in the ghetto, some of the Jewish resistance fighters had hoped to get supplies from the Polish underground, and they got some, but not enough, and the weapons didn't really work. And so there was certainly, mention of attempts to work together or gain assistance, and lots of different kinds of specific stories there. Your question, or I'm not quite sure whose question, no, it was your question about the resistance movements in occupied Europe at the time. That is a great question. My knowledge does not allow, my knowledge of all those other resistance movements is limited. So I can't really speak to any sort of authority about any of these, but certainly there's a sometimes we talk about in sociology about a diffusion effect. And so like what's happening in one territory or in one kind of place, if you hear about it, that can shape your decisions about what to do in your place. My guess, though, is that, while all occupied people were suffering, I don't think it's surprising that the Warsaw Ghetto uprising happened separately from the Warsaw uprising in 1944, because of just kind of a lack of support in general. And, you know, although certainly there were Jewish people who fought in the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, who had survived and, you know, were still present and ready to fight. But it would be, I think, very fascinating and useful to draw some comparisons between all the other resistance movements happening. And you're right, maybe to test some theories about some kind of World War II resistance movements of occupied nations and kind of see the similarities and differences there. That would be very interesting. And then forgive me, was it Medine? And I'm sorry if I'm saying your first name incorrectly, dear. Thank you for introducing that question about, you know, there are reasons to resist. And again, we're talking now about armed resistance, right? Reasons to resist and then reasons not to resist. And in the ghettos, so much confusion, so much fear, so much, you know, what is the right thing to do? What should we do? And so I think these organized youth movements had some clear ideology and some clear solidarity with each other. And maybe that kind of led them to a conviction that, yes, armed resistance is the right thing to do, even though we know we're not going to survive. But sort of the civilians, as Havi would say, the regular people, there were lots of reasons not to fight back. You know, both the Nazi leadership and some of the Jewish ghetto leadership were telling people, don't fight back. It's too dangerous. If you fight back, it'll make it so much worse for us. And that was absolutely the case in Lodz and in Vilna, where the heads of the Judenrat had not committed suicide. They were still in place, from Rumkowski in Lodz and Jakob Gens, and they were telling the community, you must do what the Nazis say. And even when in Vilna, it was clear that there were young people who were planning for resistance, the ghetto leadership, the Nazi-installed ghetto leadership was telling them, don't do it. And there was this famous incident where Yitzhak Wittenberg, a resistance fighter, was wanted by the Nazis, and the community basically said, you got to turn yourself in. We would rather have the resistance die than Jewish people be made to suffer for a communist leader in the ghetto. So all kinds of kind of competing ideas to resist or not resist, and these and how these played out in, you know, kind of contingent spaces, like, you know, the special nature of the Vilna ghetto and the special nature of the Lodz ghetto, all come into play. But that question is crucially important. So thank you for asking that.
Before I continue, I would like to ask Rachel, are you on the clock? I mean, I understand you have to finish now, or do you have...
I have a class in an hour.
So
It's 2:30 here.
We have another round, if so, because
Yeah.
there's a lot of questions to you.
Yes.
There's a comment by Michael Tracer in the chat that I will not read, but it relates to this. But maybe this is a question, if we translate it into a question, is, are we really talking about people who are going to commit suicide? Or so why are they not running like suicide bombers? These people are fighting, so they must have some sense, or maybe because they're not wise enough, said Mark Edelman, because they were crazy, they must have some sense that they might get out of it somehow, as they did, some of them.
Yeah.
So it's not a suicide move. It's not a mass suicide, like a cult mass suicide. These people are fighting, but they know the odds are stacked against them. So maybe this is a... And then we have a question by Jackie Feldman, two questions. One is a lot of people appropriate the Warsaw Ghetto uprising for a lot of things. I think I had a bad experience of hearing a Warsaw Ghetto appropriated to describe Gaza, etc. People appropriate their resistance to all sorts of stuff. So did you as a researcher of this field, have you been ever drawn into such discussions where you had to bring your expertise into this? And another question is, do you think the fact, were the resistors confident that their story will live on? I mean, when Rabbi, the Rebbe from Piaseczno does his work, he makes a lot of effort to ensure that the story will live on. What about the resistance movement? And again, we also have okay, maybe we'll stop here. We have another question, maybe I'll say it by Sylvia, about, are we talking about a secular phenomenon when we talk about resistance? A sign of secularization, a part of process of secularization. So what is your input on this? So I'll stop here, and this will be our last round, and then we will wrap it up. Yes, Rachel.
Okay, excellent questions. Thank you so much. To the question about suicide, yes, thank you for that clarification. This was not, I mean, this was, and I think some people, there are accounts of some people, some individuals taking their own lives in the ghetto. You know, so suicide was a potential response. I have read testimonies where a survivor, the one I'm thinking of, she was a young woman in the ghetto, so she was maybe 12, 13, and so she had her parents with her still, and they had collectively decided they were going to commit suicide because, you know, they were suffering too much in the ghetto, but then they decided against it. But that was that is one response to a terrible situation. And but the ghetto fighters, and this is based on, you know, some of their writings, their post-war memoirs, and also some, you know, some bits that have been preserved, that they did not expect to survive the fighting. They meant to fight, and they meant not to, they did not build a bunker for themselves. They hid in other bunkers during the fighting that other people had created, but they did not expect to last very long in the fight. And so they expected to fight to the death. So not as a form of, I guess, suicide per se, but as a form of taking action that would lead to death, but it was death on their terms, fighting rather than, you know, being murdered, you know, that sort of thing. So, but that is an important distinction, and thank you for asking for that. The question about appropriation, here's what I've heard in the US. I have not been drawn into any discussion like this. I should say I'm at a kind of a conservative university, so I'm just waiting for it to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. I actually teach a class, that's what I'm going to now. It's called Hate and Violence. And we talk about hate crimes, and, you know, we talk about, you know, neo-Nazis and, you know, white supremacy and these kinds of things. And my students have been pretty good, and I have not been drawn into this, but I have certainly heard of arguments in the US for guns, to allow people to have all kinds of, like, you know, high-powered rifles and assault rifles and all these kinds of things, and justifying that by saying, well, if the Jews had weapons in the Warsaw Ghetto, or if the Jews had weapons during the Holocaust wouldn't have happened, or something like that. So I have heard those ideas, that kind of appropriation, but I personally have not been in those kinds of conversations, although they might happen. Let's see, the issue of, did the resistance fighters think that they would live on, that some aspect of them would live on? So Havi, you might be able to clarify this for me. In the Warsaw Ghetto, were the resistance fighters, they knew Emanuel Ringelblum, yes? So they were maybe were they aware of Oneg Shabbat? And, or no, I don't know. Were they they weren't involved in it, but did they think they would be memorialized that way?
I mean, some members knew some members, but that they did not know of the projects as it is. We have different reference of Jewish fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto and other places, hoping that they will be remembered as Betzalel fighters or others. But it's two different things, I believe.
Actually,
Yeah.
I must say that we can see on most of the centers of left-wing Jewish resistance, there was a very strong historical consciousness. And Antek sends one of the resistance members who gets out of the ghetto, sends him back in to bring the archive of the resistance, and they send it to Britain. So you see, you have books coming out about
but that's not Ringelblum archive.
No,
had their own archive,
archive,
which was left in the Warsaw Ghetto
They
in the Warsaw
are-
Uprising.
I agree. They are taking care of their own history.
Okay.
And they make sure that this, and this actually gets published during the war already in Israel, in Palestine. Then you see accounts of the revolt based on materials smuggled out. So these people had a very strong historical consciousness, collecting documents, collecting all sorts of materials. And so we can say that they were really interested in getting the story, in ensuring the story remains. And the fact, I think this idea of going back into the ghetto to smuggle out their own archive and getting this out to the free world, I think this is a very strong example of,
Maybe just to mention what Medain just wrote in the chat, we have a few different archives. We have Ringelblum archive, which we all the time talk about. We have Zhezheken archive, which is Berman collection, which is kept in Ghetto Fighters house. And we had different archives that some of them were lost. One of them is Dror archive that was burned in the Warsaw Uprising. The other one is the Judentrant archive. And we had other archives. So we have only a very small portion of what was written and of course said and thought in those years.
Thank you. That's why I need historians. Thank you.
Maybe Rachel, should I conclude? Or
Yes, please.
Yeah,
No,
okay,
I'm done. Thank you all.
So we keep getting comments and questions in the chat. We'll send the chat to the speakers so they can relate to it. I'll say this. I'll end with a comment by Havi in the chat. I think we must take into account when we talk about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Holocaust in general. I tell my students all the time, you know the end of the story. You know the end of the movie. These people are in the movie. They still don't know what's going on, and they don't know what will be tomorrow. So I think understanding this first gives us much humility when we talk about people in the ghettos. And I think probably also the only key to understanding is to try and put yourself from the viewpoint that these people saw. And I think and these people were acting, the resistors, on all sorts of assumptions. I think Abba Kovner has this very special call saying that there's a final solution of the plan to destroy all the Jews of Europe. And you ask him, how did you know that? People were asking, I mean, the dates don't work. I mean, he didn't have a direct line to Wanzé, whatever. And how did he know? And the answer is, it was intuition. He didn't really know. I mean, that's how he understood it, and he got it right. Got it right. But there's no direct flow of information, like Sylvia has mentioned. All the issue of information is a major story here. People don't see the world in a very narrow, their existence, they have a very narrow prism of seeing. And we have to take this when we talk about decision making and why did they do this or that. We have to take into account all the time that our people are are working in an informationless, like they don't have the information and they make assumptions and they make decisions from the information they have. And different people also have different informations, and I think this is very important. So the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, we probably will say this a lot this year, is the first major urban uprising in Europe, in occupied Europe, making it very unique in this sense. Mainly because resistance movements are under orders not to revolt. All the like the national resistance movements are either under orders from the home governments, if we take the Polish Armia Krajowa, or if we talk about the resistance with the connections in London, the instructions are not to revolt. Revolt should happen only when you can win. Only when the tanks are closed, when the liberating armies are here in a second. Even in the liberation of France, the Maquis started too early revolt in the Vercors region, and they are massacred by the Germans because the Allies have no way of getting there. So, and that's we are talking, the Allies are already on the beach, already in France, and still the decision to make the revolt in the Vercors area, and it was like a hilly area with camps for Maquis, for the resistance, and then thousands of resistance people were killed. So I only mentioned this thing, and this is, we do a lot of work on war and Holocaust, on comparing the general situation of the war and its protagonists to the Jews. What we see here is so unique because no one is coming to save the Jews. And in this sense, the idea of let's do it later and then have a chance to survive this is really, but on the other hand, they do have a survival strategy and they do get out of the ghetto. So somewhere, someone planned for this. Someone thought about this beforehand, that there will be a way of getting out. So anyway, thank you so much for this, for two amazing lectures. Thank you, Havi, as always, for your response that is always opening new venues for us. And be in touch. We will not have a program on October, but we will resume programs a month after that. And so we wish you the Jewish New Year is upon us. So have a happy New Year. May all your dreams come true for the better. And יתגשמו כל תפילותיכם לטובה. And be in touch with us. If you have any ideas, if you want to do any cooperations, we'll be happy to be in touch. This is what COVID taught us, that we can be in touch and do amazing things together. So thank you all. And Shana Tova.
Shana Tova, Shana Tova.
שנה טובה, טובה וחתימה טובה.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye, thank you.